Misfortune truly follows you wherever you go. How can you save anyone when everything you touch turns to ruin? Yuji's body moved before his mind did, fighting through the lethargic haze weighing over him to drag him out of unconsciousness. The sway of his body drew back the curtain over his eyes, thrusting the view of the ledge he stood beside into the forefront of his vision. Disoriented, Yuji struggled to catch himself as he awoke standing on his feet. His head propped up tall with nothing to keep him in place besides his immediate instinct to avoid falling onto the metal tracks below or flat on his backside as his gelatinous legs fumbled with each step. Tracks. As balance in his footing was restored, Yuji took a cautious step forward to peer over the ledge once more. Observing the parallel lines of steel stretching down the tunnel as far as Yuji's eyes could perceive them. Flickering down to his own feet, the difference in height between the tracks and the tips of his shoes was only a meter or so deep. But the fear of falling twisted the plunge into that of an immeasurable free fall. Vertigo grew stronger with each passing second, forcing Yuji to step back once more. He took in a deep breath, expanding his lungs to the fullest upon throwing his head back to stare blankly at the cold ceiling looming over him. The air was stale, almost gag-worthy. A constant, high-pitched whine drifted through the hollow underground station. A cry for repair from one of the many dimming circuits the lights ran on. Barely functioning, half the light fixtures weren't emitting any light at all, leaving most of the platform in shadow, while the brightest out of the bunch flickered at the edge of Yuji's vision. Without the sound of crowded footsteps and competing conversations to fill in the stagnant void Yuji wavered in, he turned his head in the direction of the only stimuli that drew his interest. Holding his breath at the sight which had been waiting for him. Several meters away, mirroring where Yuji stood, was his bitter reflection basking in the glow of the flickering light. Switching between his face and that of the unmistakable curse that burned through every positive emotion he dared let himself indulge in. There was no reason to speak. The sentiments shared between them went beyond words, the understanding of where they stood relative to the other ingrained too deep for the mind to ignore. Yuji lunged forward. Hesitation be damned. Fist raised, his body moved to the fury in his heart, eyes narrowed on the face that haunted the nightmares which greeted him when the waking world was out of his reach. The distance between them disappeared in less than a second. Yuji moved fast, but his target moved faster, offering no time to register the shift in positioning, nor the speed in the curse acted in retaliation to his advance. All it took was one blink, and Yuji's fist connected with nothing. But one miss would not deter him. He gritted his teeth. Yuji pivoted to his right, unwinding his first strike while preparing for the second. The fingers of his left hand curled in bloodthirsty anticipation. His target had only moved a few steps aside, deeming Yuji not enough of a threat to warrant any action that could be misconstrued as a retreat. Die. The second strike did not hit flesh, but the concrete pillar behind the empty spot the curse left behind. Crumbling under Yuji's fingers, he growled at the brazen impact recoiling through his bones. Dust and bits of debris fell from the ceiling as an agonizingly familiar voice echoed through the empty station. Careful now. You'll bring the whole place down on us acting that way. What about all those innocent people? What people? Yuji spun around to the sight of a station packed with civilians, unmoving, trapped in an unsettling trance, before blotches of red filled in the edges of his vision. People, unmoving bodies lined the ground. Crimson fresh blood pooled at his feet. A cry for help, a desperate scream, rang through Yuji's ears. The world twisted around him. A dizzying display of carnage that disappeared the moment the curse's hand engulfed his face. The tips of sharpened claws dug into the surface of Yuji's skin. With an unbearable amount of force, the back of his head collided with the ground with the rest of his body along for the ride. The shock alone was enough to tear Yuji's vision from him, but he regained the use of his eyes only seconds after. Struggling to combat the swirling effect that only served to make the face smirking down at him all the more detestable. Sakuna. Whatever this place was, Yuji swore he would tear that smug look off with his bare hands. To hell with the impermanence of a dream, just the act of getting rid of him, even once, for a single second, would bring some semblance of catharsis he so desperately required. The curse removed his hold to admire his handiwork. This is a good look for you. But acting in blind rage won't yield results any different from our last little foray. Blind rage? Yuji wasn't blind. The monster that held all his contempt, all of his hatred, stood over him in such a way that he could see nothing else but the curse that threw him on the ground. Well, what trouble have you brought upon yourself this time? Sukuna let out a whistle as his eyes swept through the station, pulling on loose threads of the time's fabric. Are you an idiot? Oh, wait. Refusing to take the insult lying down, Yuji flipped himself onto his stomach with the intention of shoving himself off the floor when Sukuna's heel dug into the center of his back. The teenager's chin slammed into the ground, snapping his jaw shut with enough force to draw blood. I did not give you permission to stand. Yuji spat the metallic taste in his mouth at the base of Sukuna's kimono. I hate you. Good. Sukuna pulled back his heel. A foolish sense of relief washed over Yuji all too soon as the teenager was given a chance to take in a gasp of air, only to choke on it as the same foot kicked in his ribs and propelled his body into the nearby wall. The risk of moving again was one Yuji willingly took, failing to prop himself up with little more than a pitiful slouch. He couldn't tell if the crunch in his ears was the sound of his bones snapping or the wall falling apart behind him, but if he was being truly honest, neither troubled him more than the curse slowly sauntering toward him. Yuji had to move. He had to fight. Even if every breath he took stung and his arms grew heavy, his muscles burning from an exhaustion he didn't know he had. Inaction was nothing less than an insult. And here you are, believing you can alter history without possessing any clue of the repercussions your floundering is bound to cause. Let me guess, you're going to warn that accursed brat about his future ceiling? The possession of that boy standing so close beside him? My return? Try as you might, but you can't get rid of me so easily. We were destined for each other, you and I, vessel and host. It's what you were created for. Yuji's limbs twitched as he glared through Sukuna's condescending monologue. Don't look at me like that. I don't care for the revelation either. The curse turned down to his nails with a malign grin. You leave so much to be desired. A surge of energy pulsed through Yuji, jolting him to his feet. Impulse demanded he struck back, if not with words then with force, the dented metal trash can beside him offering the perfect bludgeoning weapon to aim at the bastard's face. If you're trying to get me to doubt myself and stop, it won't work. I'm going to try no matter what you say. Yuji lifted the trash can by the opening in its lid and chucked it as hard as he could muster. If I can do one thing in this life, it's killing you. The teenager's attack bounced off Sukuna with a flick of the curse's wrist. It was expected, marking the perfect opportunity to rush the curse while he was distracted. His goal was to strike from the side, a left hook empowered with as much cursed energy as he could pull together in such a short window. Unaware that he had telegraphed his movements with his enraged bid for power. Without turning his head, Sukuna caught Yuji's fist with ease. You're nowhere close to accomplishing that goal than when you started. One twist was all it took to spin Yuji back onto the ground, but the teenager tore himself free at the last second, able to land on his knees and bounce back to his feet as if his body were rubber. In truth, he felt every impact, though he did his best not to care. I suppose you could spare the timeline the trouble and consume the fingers of this world in your counterpart's stead. If you're going to keep playing with fire, why stroke embers when you can hold the sun in your hands? Hell no. I'm not giving you any more power. And you call me an idiot? Do you really think you'd just merge with the Sukuna of this time, or would there be two of you to fight for control? Neither outcome was a viable one. One Sukuna was more than enough to endure, but a possible second one? And even if Yuji could take in an additional 20 fingers without zero complications, that wouldn't just remove Sukuna from this time, but bring about a worse, supercharged problem instead unless he could find a way back to the year they came from. Without knowing the cause of their temporal shift, there was a very real possibility that Chozo and he were stuck here. With the ruins they left behind, Yuji couldn't forgive himself for what he believed was essentially running away from it. Leaving Fushiguro and Akostu to deal with the aftermath on their own if they weren't mixed up in this as well. By his own will or not. Why do I even bother? Though I doubt you'll get the chance to anyway. I wonder, when they find out what you are, what we did, will they let you live this time around? The images of Shibuya flashed across Yuji's eyes. The blood. The fire. The dust as it settled at the base of his shoes. Stop it. There was no justifying the carnage that day. No excuses to be made. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. Sakuna did what he pleased, dragging Yuji along for the ride until his rampage had subsided and there was nothing left to ruin. The one with the shadow over him, Suguru, was it? I bet he'd gladly see you killed. You're more cursed than human, Sakuna hummed as he walked, his steps shaking the very foundation Yuji stood on. The curse circled him as a predator would, keeping at least one of his 4 eyes on Yuji at all times as he continued to muse aloud. How hard would it be to convince the 6 eyes to go along with him? They seem pretty close. No wonder that sorcerer was foolish enough to fall for the trap those curses laid for him. That death painting attached at your hip would object, but they'd make quick work of him, I'm sure. You're wrong. The faint blaring of a train's horn called out to Yuji from the depths of the subway tunnel, attempting to drown out the objections screaming from the core of his heart. His sensei wouldn't do that. Not until the deed is done and all the fingers were consumed. That was the deal they made. Not that it mattered when the Gojo he just met had no awareness of their deal. Yuji couldn't find it in him to blame either of them for believing his death to be necessary. After Shibuya, it was hard to bring himself to argue otherwise. But that was all the more reason to make up for his failures now. If it was possible to relay a proper warning and change what was to come, he could only hope that his sensei's younger self would listen to him. And if time worked so that the year Yuji came from remained unaffected by his actions here, then it was his duty to at least make the attempt to return and fix what little he could of the world while he remained able. At least then he could die, in a better conscience than what he had now. It's okay, brat, I don't intend to let you meet your end. Try as they might, the moment your life is in peril, I'll relish the chance to finally bring the death of that 6-eyed sorcerer as I swore to. I'll go so far as to vow on it. If Yuji was supposed to find any solace in that comment, the curse was surely mistaken. Perhaps you're right about making the most of our time here. The past presents such enamoring opportunities. Our rematch was stolen from me upon his sealing, and while not ideal, just ending the life of one Gojo would be enough. For now. That won't happen. I won't let you. The horn blows again, the repetitive clang of wheels along the tracks growing ever closer. A flurry of blows. Yuji released a series of mindless strikes one after another, adrenaline and instinct guiding his movements as Sakuna weaved through them without a shred of concern. Where Yuji made several attempts to connect with his foe, the curse made one solid uppercut with his palm into the already bruised underside of the teenager's chin. Before Yuji could be thrown back, the curse's fingers curled and grasped his face, holding him in place as the curse's free hand rammed into his stomach, threatening to spill what little contents were inside. Sakuna repeated the motion, holding Yuji in the air like a ragged doll. We'll see. Aggressive claws yanked Yuji close before thrusting him across the platform and into the blinding headlights now engulfing the tracks. Drenched in white, the last sensation Yuji perceived was the deafening horn that blasted through his eardrums, drowning every other aspect of the world before he could even brace for the eventual impact. Yuji choked for air. Flying forward, the teenager only made himself sick as the blood from his head drained from his skull, leaving him fighting to remain sitting up with hands grasping for the nearest thing to latch onto. Blanket. Mattress. Arm. Sleeve. Chozo. Yuji opened his eyes to meet the one he accepted as his brother sitting next to him, a hand already propping up his back while the other acted as an anchor for Yuji to keep himself steady. He was in a bedroom. The familiar landscape of the world outside his window told him he was back in Jujutsu Tech, but he knew better than to believe he was back in his old room. This was the guest house. He was a stranger intruding on their campus, in a time he didn't belong in. Are you okay? Chozo's words were nearly silent, the movement of his mouth doing more to convey his concern. No. Yeah, I'm good, Yuji breathed, giving Chozo's arm a good squeeze before letting go, all too aware that his brother did not believe him. Just working through some things. Chozo looked as if he'd had something to retort with, but the sudden harsh smack of something heavy falling down the hall got in his way. His older brother wasn't nearly as startled as Yuji was, his reaction delayed as he responded to Yuji's flinch instead of the sound itself as if he'd expected it to happen. Either way, Yuji was grateful for the distraction marking the topic's end. Retreating into himself came easier than expected. Not usually one to overthink much of anything, it was a strange feeling to overanalyze the very real and very tedious situation he was in. If Sakuna was right about one thing, floundering through this would not do anything but make things worse than where they started. And then Gojo-sensei's younger self Satoru. But that name appeared to be reserved for one person only. Returned with Iori and Geto, and floundering was all that Yuji could do. How could Yuji do otherwise when the man who sailed his sensei and plunged Japan into ruin stood just a few meters from him? Two opposing forces were hellbent on keeping Yuji off balance each time he spoke. The familiar voice and mannerisms of his sensei lulling him back into a routine he had already given up on falling into, while the presence of the one beside him drove his fight or flight instincts into a frenzy. In the very short period of time Yuji had to observe the two, he knew three things. Gojo called Geto by his first name and the other did the same. They were close. Not just in proximity, but in the way they spoke. Sensei's infinity didn't register Geto as a threat. The last one stood out the most to Yuji, given that out of the cursed energy he could sense from the two of them, Geto's energy felt rotten. Murky and tangled in itself while rivaling Gojo's in intensity. The very limited and spotty knowledge Yuji had of Geto's future self didn't leave the displaced teenager questioning why his energy felt that way. But for neither of Geto's friends, Gojo was friendly enough with him, almost too friendly for Yuji's taste, to be bothered by it. There was something more to what he felt than the obvious red flags that waved over the Geto's shoulders. This was the man responsible for an event Yuji had only heard in passing whispers between the second years referred to as the Night Parade of 100 Demons. Dual attacks on Kyoto and Tokyo. The school was also hit, with the damages from last year still present in several areas that weren't deemed broken enough to repair. In all honesty, Yuji never thought much of the event as anything but a thing that happened before his arrival, but when Geto's name was spoken by Chozo to catch Akotsu and Fashiguro up to speed, the same silent look of contempt the other second years would express took over their senpai's face. The change was brief, but it was enough to know that there was a history Yuji wasn't aware of when it came to the body Kamo Noritoshi possessed. Only in hindsight could Yuji curse himself, he should have made an attempt to learn more. It was only now that Yuji could begin to understand how Geto's body played into sealing his sensei. If Junpei had appeared in the flesh before him, Yuji knew he wouldn't have acted any differently, needing much more than a moment to process what he was seeing. Let alone ask just how it was possible for them to be speaking. The difference was, Yuji truly believed Junpei to be a good person, caught and cornered to be taken advantage of. He couldn't say the same for Geto. It would be easy to write him off as someone untrustworthy and be done with it. But he didn't know enough about him to say if this was the same monster who attacked his upperclassman or the friend of Gojo Satoru. Were they both one and the same? Chozo didn't appear to believe so. At least he acted like it, his reserved nature doing well to ground Yuji's dwindling tolerance for the face that plunged his world into chaos. Yuji did his best to hold what he could in and follow along, especially as their story was under such heavy scrutiny. What Yuji could conclude from all this was that if he was going to alter the future, he would need to earn enough trust for Gojo to believe him. It won't be enough to tell him about what will happen, but how it got to that point, and if Yuji started pointing fingers without any credibility, his sensei might push back and refuse to listen. Geto already didn't trust him. The suspicious glares and the way he spoke to them already made that clear. If only Yuji hadn't made things worse for himself by sputtering out his death at Akotsu's hand so easily. As the conversation that spiraled out from there did nothing but dig a further hole of explanations he needed to give. In his defense, they were going to find out about the wound, or lack thereof, eventually. Bringing Iori in had already dashed away any hopes Yuji had in hiding such telltale signs of an attack, and ripping the band-aid off such heavy topics came easily to him. He deliberately chose his words after that, avoiding the specific circumstances of his sensei's sealing, as it would be better to explain it with the context of the entire attack on Shibuya than in the bits and pieces he'd been providing. Gojo had even agreed with him, and the offer of a break, which would give Yuji ample time to gather his thoughts, was more than generous on his part. All Yuji had to do was answer another question to earn it. And his sensei was right about it being an easy answer. Ryomen Sukuna. The curse's warning repeated itself inside Yuji's mind, stirring up the fear he had in their reactions once the initial shock of his answer subsided. It wasn't the possibility of an immediate execution that scared him, but Sukuna's own retaliation if they somehow managed to botch it. Yuji found it hard to look Gojo in the eye, unsure what expression was hiding under the older teenager's sunglasses as his mouth remained partially open and still. And just when his shades were about to slide off and provide even a hint of a clue to what was going on in his head, Gojo jerked forward in his seat and clapped his hands together. Well, time for drinks. I'm thinking of that white peach soda I had the other day. Eh? Was there something wrong with his sensei's ears? Had Yuji misspoken? Gojo bounced on his toes as he got up and maneuvered to the door, stopped only by Geto, whose feet remained firmly planted in the hallway. Geto's arms were crossed, unfolding only when Gojo attempted to scoot past him as an arm now stood in his way. Satoru. Sensei ignored him, staring past his shoulders to avoid the very cross look on Geto's face. Shoko, I'm gonna guess a coffee for you. Stop ignoring me. And for Suguru. You look a little tense. A milk tea it is. Gojo attempted to push his way further into the hall, darting left when Geto used his body to block the right. Only for the sequence to repeat itself over with each failure to get through. I don't want milk tea. Okay, fine. You can pick your own drink. No need to whine so much about it. You know that is not what this is about. That name, you can't just pretend you didn't hear Itadori say that he's possessed by the King of Curses. That was the reaction Yuji expected to receive. Explosive, borderline horrified at the thought of Sukuna's presence with a few steps from one's person. Then again, Gojo's reaction wasn't much different to how they first met. The same carefree attitude on display, as if the threat the curse's very existence made was not enough for Gojo to take seriously. All that was missing was his sensei demanding to fight the Sukuna himself. Yuji refused to play along with that request a second time. Yeah, Sukuna. All-powerful king of curses from 1,000 years ago, I heard him just fine. But it's break time, and I want something to drink. Move with a forceful shove, Gojo broke Geto's barricade and stumbled into the hallway, earning a measly taste of freedom before the back of his collar was used to yank him back. The sight sent a shiver down Yuji's spine, hands too close to his sensei's neck for comfort. You can't just walk away. You're right. Gojo cocked his head back, cheeky eyes poking out from behind his shades to address Yuji, still a bit bewildered by the sight in front of him. I almost forgot, do you want anything from the vending machines? No, Yuji squeaked, very much aware of the growing intensity of the cursed energy surrounding the two. While he was the one getting dragged into their fight by Gojo, but the younger teenager sure as hell felt as if he was the one intruding on something he had no business in. I think I'm good. Enough with the fucking drinks. Geto yanked Gojo's collar a second time. How is that your priority? Is this all a game to you? Everything else aside, we can't hold off reporting this to our sensei any longer. And if you're not going to do something about... And what would you have me do? Gojo ripped Geto's hands off him, discarding his newfound freedom to shout back with irritation to match the other teenager's demands. Tell me, oh great and wise Suguru. What course of action is under my responsibility? Because if you say what I think you're going to say, God, you're such a pain in my ass. Someone has to be. His sensei stepped closer, sneered, lips incoherently mocking the very words Geto snapped at him. Gojo's actions only escalated their conflict further. He pushed every button Geto had, both figuratively and literally. With a dismissive shove, Gojo easily dragged his classmate down to his level, prompting Geto to shove him back. On the verge of a fist fight, the sound of shoes scuffing the ground and elbows knocking into walls could be heard as the two stumbled further down the hallway to continue their shouting match. Neither one turned back to acknowledge the people they were leaving in the room behind them, despite being the very subject of their furious debate. The whole display was as ridiculous as it was concerning. Only when the two left his sight did he picture them as the adults he remembered. The image of two powerful sorcerers flailing at each other was unnerving, all things considered. A nervous chuckle rose from that feeling, sounding more akin to a cough as he fought it back, not wishing to come across as though he were enjoying their fight. It was the opposite. Yuji wanted them to stop. Sometimes it's their world, and we just live in it, you know? Yuji flinched at the slight shake of the mattress as Iori sat down beside him, claiming the bottom corner for herself. He'd almost forgotten she was still in the room, mastering the art of weaving around the other two the moment tensions began to rise. Iori's statement was not only referring to the ongoing scuffle outside, but relating her own experience with those two and what she assumed Yuji had dealt with prior. And she was partially right. Yuji's sensei still did whatever he pleased, forcing the world to revolve around him whenever he felt inclined. But that didn't fit the entire statement. What a couple of overgrown children, Iori let out a whine before Yuji had a chance to respond. Should we stop them? Or Yuji pointed toward the open door. Nah, those two are like crying babies. Just let them make all the noise they want and eventually, they tire themselves out. Falling back on her hands, Iori tilted her head in curiosity as she looked over to Yuji once more. So, to be clear, you aren't pulling some kind of joke. Right? A joke. Life would be so much easier if it were. No, I wouldn't joke about this. Sorry. Man, somehow I feel like we should be the sorry ones. Iori crossed her legs and dug a hand into her pocket, pulling out a box of smokes. Want one? The ash clinging to Iori's clothes had singed Yuji's nose when Iori first entered, but seeing her with actual cigarettes in hand was still surprising. The smell coming from her was new to him. Smoking is bad for your health, Chozo cut in, frowning at the offer being shaken in front of Yuji's face. And I believe smoking indoors is frowned upon. Following his brother's statement, declined the offer with his hand. He had no interest in smoking to begin with, and now felt like a hell of a time to start. Yeah, it totally is. Iori placed a half-used cigarette between her teeth before putting away the rest. She did not bother searching for a lighter, but nonetheless went through the motions of smoking as if she had. Must be out of habit then. Smoking is the worst. Shifting in his seat once more, Chozo leaned forward to continue speaking without having to raise his voice and draw in the attention of the two outside. My intention is not to offend, but your reaction to my brother's situation is unusually composed compared to your classmates. Equally, I don't understand why you got closer when they pulled away. Iori balanced her cigarette between her fingers. She thought about Chozo's words for a moment, shrugging off his underlying suspicion. I'm friends with the two strongest sorcerers in the world. If anything happens, say an evil curse took over and tried to kill me, I trust them to have my back. That being said, being stuck in the same year as them means I have almost 3 years of experience dealing with their dumbasses and I know how explosive their arguments get. Sitting here with you two is better for my health. Unless you want to prove me wrong. Yuji shook his head. Iori had a lot of faith in Gojo and Geto alike. Seeing as how she went along with his sensei's antics when they got older with a certain request to keep Yuji's revival a secret, it was heartwarming to see just how far back the two went. Somehow, that translated to trusting Yuji as well. Iori-san, I know you trust Gojo-sensei a lot, but is that a good idea to extend that to me? We barely met. I can't hear Gojo and Sensei together in the same sentence. She pinched the bridge of her nose, exaggerating her annoyance as the grin on her face contradicted her words. Of course, Gojo wouldn't just have any curse-possessed kid as his student. The strongest curse for the strongest sorcerer. Bet he still has the same ego too. Oh, yeah. Figures. Can't go wishing for miracles in this day and age, Iori let out a curt sigh. Despite what Geto says, Gojo isn't screwing around. At least not entirely. He believes you enough to listen, so I'm giving you and your story the benefit of the doubt. No need to make a big deal out of it. A rather devious look appeared on Iori's face as she paused to listen for evidence of the fight that had faded to the background of their conversation. Gojo and Geto's voices had significantly lowered since they started, but neither had left the building, which meant they were still going at it. Quick, before they come back, tell me something stupid either of them has done. Stupid. Yuji's brain stuttered, blanking on anything that could meet the criteria Iori was looking for. Anything he could say about Geto would certainly ruin the pleasant mood they built up, which left him scrambling for something to say about his sensei. Getting sailed was pretty stupid. But that wasn't what Iori was looking for, either. Come on Yuji, think. I guess, it's not stupid, but sensei slipped in baseball into the box with the competition methods in it. You know, the one for the Goodwill event with Kyoto? At least, I'm almost positive it was him. Neither of the principals did it, that's for sure. No way. You're lying. Sorcerers competing in a game of baseball? Are team battles too boring? I'm not lying. I even have a picture to prove. Yuji stopped talking the moment his hand hit a rectangular piece of plastic in his hoodie's front pocket. The once smooth surface was now littered with cracks. The jagged edges bit into his fingers as he pulled the device out, preemptively warning him of the large diagonal gash across his screen. He could only count himself lucky the cut was clean, or else the entire sheet of glass would be shattered and unusable. I'm such an idiot. Upon clicking the power button, he spun his phone around for Iori to get a good look at the home screen, along with the date and time on display. How's this for proof of the future? Do you guys still use flip phones or have touch screens hit the market yet? I can't remember. That's a phone? It's so thin. Quickly, Yuji pulled back the device and flipped through his photos, looking for the one he had Inumaki take for him the day of their baseball game. He hurried through his gallery, unable to linger on any image too long, as he already felt the tightening grip on his heart get worse with each passing memory. Group missions. Watching movies with Fushiguro. Training. Outings with Kujisaki. Baseball. There they were. A group photo, taken right after the match had concluded. Someone else's phone was used to take the big team picture, but Yuji had asked to use his for just the first years, with their sensei crashing the moment by inserting himself behind them. Fushiguro stood in the center, helmet on and head down, forced in place by an arm from Yuji and Kujisaki each. Yuji donned his baseball mitt in his free hand, while Kujisaki proudly brandished her baseball bat, looking as if she was on the verge of pummeling someone rather than posing for the camera. All three were covered in dirt from the waist down. Sweaty and tired, they did their best to smile for the camera even if none of them could compete with their sensei's self-satisfied grin as the man bent down to rest his head on Fushiguro's helmet. That was the first time Yuji had gotten a picture of the four of them together. Why did it feel like such a long time ago? Here, see, we even had to wear uniforms. Watching Iori's eyes widen at the image in his hand helped Yuji's mood to bounce back a bit, only because of how animated her expression had become. That's us first years with him. Holy crap, the cigarette Iori had returned to her mouth dropped on the floor, going completely ignored as she scooted forward to squint at the screen. Time travel is real and Gojo hasn't aged a goddamned day. That bastard won the genetic lottery. And are those dad clothes? A buttoned-up shirt? Slacks? Who in their right mind wears that to a baseball game? Sensei Yuji answered, flipping the screen over to show Chozo the photo before moving on to the next one. He wears something similar to his school uniform most of the time. But with a blindfold. It wasn't too hard to find an image of Gojo that matched his description, settling on a picture of his sensei demonstrating how to create a curtain. He was standing in the center of the track field, with Yuji and his other classmates sitting on the steps behind the camera with varying levels of enthusiasm for the lecture. A blindfold. What is he doing with his hair? Iori fell forward, gripping her sides tight as he plunged into a laughing fit beside him. Who in their right mind gave him hair gel? He looks like even more of a menace than he does now, all spiked up like that. What do you mean? I think he looks cool. Iori continued to snicker, holding nothing back as she looked over the image once more. You're his student. You don't count. I do too. Shoko. The burst of footsteps barreling down the hall accompanied Iori's name as both Gojo and Geto trampled over each other in the hall, each claiming the doorway for themselves, leading to both squeezing through to get into the room. It was only when she made significant noise did the two realize who they had left behind, returning to the small group with a mix of relief and confusion as Iori continued to laugh in her seat. Gojo, looks like such a dork, she gasped for air as she pointed to Yuji's phone. In the future. Like a smug feather duster. A feather duster. Gojo barged over to the device in Yuji's hands, with Geto hovering just below his shoulder. Is that supposed to be me? 'Cause if so, I think the word you're looking for is tall and handsome. No, Shoko's right. A feather duster is a perfect description. Geto's comment came before he could react to the image in full, reeling back from the group as visible disbelief fought the evidence in front of him. His words lacked the same snappy attitude as before, his energy drained from everything else that has already transpired. With everyone so close together, Yuji noted that whatever had transpired between the two outside appeared to have concluded somewhat amicably. Given that neither had torn the other apart when no one was looking. Whatever they spoke about must have flipped some kind of switch. Growing increasingly aware that his phone was a one-way trip to bringing about the same disaster as before. Once a single request was made to see a certain someone missing from Yuji's campus and subsequently, his camera roll. The younger teenager swiftly brought the device closer to his chest. He allowed himself one more quick glance down at the photo of his sensei as he knew him before shutting off the screen. Taking advantage of Yuji's withdrawal, Iori openly chastised her friends. Also, really, it took you both how long to realize you left me behind? And you dare come back with not even a single drink? Such gentlemen you are. We never even, sorry. I would have gotten them by now if someone didn't stop me. Gojo flashed Geto an annoyed look and groaned. New plan. No leaving anyone alone until we talk the rest out. We go to the vending machines together. Get drinks. Work out the gritty details and move on. We're all capable of behaving, right Suguru? The fact you can even say that with a straight face with how you've acted is a feature Ringanly you can accomplish. The deadpan sound of Geto's voice only further hammered at his point. Yet still unable to break through the brick wall that was Yuji's sensei ego. Or, you always know how to make me blush. Yuji was positive that the 5-minute mark had passed some time ago. Even if the time had officially begun after the last can fell out of the vending machine, the silence that followed lasted too long. Draining him more than any conversation would have if they had just kept going from the start. Yuji had originally stood against the flat wall opposite of the vending machines upon their arrival. The pavilion was the same as he'd left it, or was going to leave it a decade from now. The only thing that changed was the drinks brands each machine offered, the vendor cycling through new brands every so often to shake things up, even all the way out in a remote school such as theirs. For someone who was so vehemently against his sensei's plan, Geto did not reject the drink upon being forcibly pressed into his hand. A milk tea, just as Gojo had said he'd get him earlier. What changed? The drink Chozo had gotten him had already settled at room temperature. But that did nothing to stop Yuji from cracking open the top of the can and slowly sipping away at it while the 3 students who officially attended the school paid for their things. Or, more accurately, his sensei paid for their drinks as it was he who fought so hard to come here in the first place. Having something to occupy their mouths made for a good excuse to pretend nothing was out of the ordinary. Indulging in normality, for even a moment, took a bit of weight off Yuji's chest. Just not all of it. Even with the proof of the future his phone provided, the status of Sakuna within his body guaranteed that Geto's careful eye remained trained on him. Somehow, it felt like they were delaying the inevitable. What that inevitable was, Yuji didn't know. If he had to guess, it was going to depend on what he was willing to share. Unfortunately, consuming caffeine wasn't bringing the burst of energy Yuji had hoped it would. The effects weren't appearing fast enough, but drinking any more at once was going to make him sick. This dilemma offered no remedy. Leaving the younger teenager to give up on standing entirely to conserve energy as he thought about the best way to start talking if that was what the others were waiting on. Yuji? All eyes shifted to him as Chozo dropped to his knees, worried Yuji had collapsed for a reason beyond his own desire to do so. His brother was so attentive, it was almost frightening. He wasn't used to anyone showing that level of concern, and as overwhelming as it could be at times, he couldn't say he hated it either. He stared down into the opening of the can in his hands, barely able to make out the liquid inside from the lack of proper lighting the evening hours couldn't provide. I ate Sukuna's finger. There, that wasn't so hard, now was it? Come again. Gojo cupped his hand against his ear as he beckoned for Yuji to repeat himself. I ate Sukuna's finger. Last June, about 4 months ago. It's how this whole possession thing started. His sensei hummed while taking a large sip of his soda. And what did it taste like? Both Iori and Geto turned to him, mirroring the same baffled expression, down to the single raised eyebrow in judgment without having to say it out loud. Like really old soap. Absolutely disgusting. Yuji grabbed his neck to combat the phantom sensation of the ancient finger sliding down his throat. And the taste just lingers for a while. Iori choked on her coffee, leading her to punch Gojo in the arm for bringing about Yuji's answer. Sensei lightly flicked her back. And while the two were leering at each other, Geto broke them up by pressing Yuji's story further. Willingly. Returning his gaze downward, Yuji answered. Yeah, it wasn't as if Yuji didn't have a choice that day. He could have died by the other curse's hands instead. He could have grabbed his senpais and ran, let Fushiguro deal with it, or he could have just not shown up to the school at all. But none of those options were ones he could have forgiven himself for living with. My senpais unraveled the binding talismans around it at school. They didn't know what they had found, and by the time we could get back to warn them, we were too late. Things got from bad to worse, and I couldn't. This giant cursed spirit was after Sukuna's finger. It had me in its hands, trying to eat both me and the finger. I figured if there was a small chance I could save them using its power, it would have been worth the risk. I guess I didn't know what outcome I expected, but everyone got to walk away with their lives that day. The aluminum can in Yuji's hands dented at the slightest amount of pressure. He held himself back from crushing it entirely, but the sound of the crackling metal was enough to ground Yuji in the present, as he flipped through the events that followed. It was then we figured out that I could suppress Sukuna and remain in possession of my body. Gojo-sensei used that knowledge to postpone my execution, under the agreement that I search for and consume the rest of Sukuna's fingers. If I die after eating all 20 fingers, he dies with me. And you agreed to that. Gojo now stood over Yuji with a scowl that didn't belong on his face. I mean, it's a great plan. Future me thought of it, so it has to be, but what? You just down the rest and then kill yourself? Hooray, the world is saved. Sunshine and rainbows for the rest of our days. Why was Sensei so mad? Did he not understand how dangerous Sukuna was? The title King of Curses wasn't for show. Yuji witnessed that firsthand. His fingers alone were enough to ravage lives, and those barely had a will to act on without a proper host for Sukuna to work with. Ensuring Sukuna's permanent demise was necessary. Yes, I did. It's my fault Sukuna incarnated in the first place. I swallowed that first finger. I might as well follow through with the rest. Yuji didn't mean to snap. He didn't mean to bare his teeth, lashing back at Gojo's words. I was born to be Sukuna's vessel. Literally, no one else could do this but me. And that means you have to do it? Obviously. Geto grabbed his sensei's shoulder, stopping him from whatever he was on the verge of screaming next. His eyes were fixated somewhere else, looking off to where the hall opened up to the campus outside. When Geto finally spoke, he was addressing Yuji even if he would not look at him as his sensei did. How many fingers have you consumed since the first? 14. 15 in total. 3/4. 75% of the way there. 5 left to go. And Yuji had originally thought that finding the first 4 was going a bit too fast. In 4 months his sensei squatted down beside him, poking a finger into his forehead, rocking his head back and forth as he scolded him. It ain't a competition, how are you still sane? Yuji didn't know how to answer that, if he could. On some days, he really felt like he was going to lose it. Not control over Sakuna, but of himself. He was just so tired. I'm managing just fine. Have you ever lost control? It was Iori's voice that poked out from behind them. If she hadn't been the one to ask, surely someone else would have. Yuji didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to even think about it. But he couldn't find it in him to lie either. Even if he was deemed a threat after all this, the least he could do was be honest and hope they listened to the rest of his story before any further action was taken. Yes, he held up 3 fingers in the air, holding them for a few seconds before shamefully dropping his hand back to his side. 3 times. Swallowing back the lump forming in his throat, Yuji kept his breathing steady as he recounted each one. The first time was when I swallowed the first finger. Sakuna was ranting about his return when I held him back and took over. He was so pissed too, the curses non-stop screaming still rang in Yuji's ears. The unrelenting threats against him and the cursing, it didn't end until Gojo had knocked him unconscious after their fight. The second time was against a special grade cursed spirit. Us first years were sent on a mission that was above our pay grade. It was a cursed wound when we got there. But things change. I swapped out with Sakuna on purpose, hoping to give the others time to escape the partial domain we got trapped in while the special grade was focused on me, and it could have gone better. My friends made it out okay. That's the important part. Yuji left out the part where Sakuna tore out his heart and tossed it aside to take him hostage. Fushiguro almost died, lying by omission was different, right? It's not like what he had left to recount was any better. The third time was, right after Sensei's sealing. Everyone was scattered, searching for ways to bring down the curtains surrounding the area, so we could reverse what happened and I lost control. Sakuna took over, the can in Yuji's hand crushed under his grip, sticky liquid spilling all over his hand as he forced himself to recall each image that damned curse showed him. He fought like a monster. He took on a special grade that burned through the streets and when faced with something that could counter his attacks if given enough time, Sakuna summoned his domain and took all of Shibuya and all the people there with it. Yuji's mouth was so dry, but his eyes had gotten so wet. Breathing was becoming a chore. Since when did the air become so stale? I've seen what Sakunas can be capable of. And I know I haven't seen all of it either. Geto-san's right, sensei. You need to take this seriously. Sakuna's not like other curses. I know after what I've said, I deserve to die here and now, but I can't. Not until I make things right. I need to free my sensei, stop what Kamo Noritoshi is planning and kill Ryomen Sakuna. If it's impossible for me to go back to my time, then by all means kill me if you know it'll stick. But if there is a way I can return, I can't leave everyone else to clean up the mess I left behind. I wouldn't be right to them. If he wasn't slouching against the wall, Yuji would be on his knees begging. Not for their forgiveness, but for their understanding. He couldn't lift his head. He didn't want to see the detestable looks, the hatred for what he's done. Nor could he bear to see the disappointment that his sensei had to have in him for not doing better. For not fighting back harder. For letting Sakuna get away with the destruction that curse craved so deeply. I do believe your friend told you that the sorcerer's failure in Shibuya was not a burden you alone had to carry. Yet you leave out everyone who failed you, regardless. Chozo was right. Fushiguro said that, but his brother rose to his feet, addressing the trio in front of them while Yuji was expected to listen along with them to what he had to say. The one responsible for leading the attack on Shibuya and Gojo Satoru's sealing worked with a group of cursed spirits who, like myself, display the same intelligence as that of a human. Their goal was to facilitate Sukuna's complete takeover of my brother's body, looking to use him as a means to wipe out the human population with needless destruction. Our fight during this time left Yuji vulnerable and Gojo took advantage of that. 11 fingers were forced down my brother's throat. It was a losing battle from the start. You were fighting? Why? Gojo was the one to ask, speaking over Yuji's head. Because Yuji killed their brothers. He was a murderer. Kamo, fake Kamo, as you put it, pitted us against each other. He informed neither of us of our relation, leaving me to only realize who I had almost killed after Sukuna had been dragged out. I should have seen it earlier. I failed Yuji, and he was forced to pay the price of my misguided actions. How could Chozo have known differently? Hold on, time out. You're admitting to working with the guy who seals me in the future? You know, the evil bastard who apparently works with cursed spirits too? For human genocide? Whose side are you on here? Yuji tensed at Gojo's line of questioning, terrified for Chozo's safety more so than his own. Whatever they decided to do about Yuji was one thing, but the thought of losing Chozo, the brother he never knew he had, shook him far more than his own safety was concerned. I'm on my brother's side. Chozo's answer was the same one he'd given Yuji during their fight with Kamo. I only worked with those curses because they freed myself and 2 of my younger brothers from our confinement. It was through fake Kamo's neglecting to mention our shared heritage that I then lost Izo and Ketchizu, with Yuji almost meeting the same fate. If I had known it was my father to whom I was speaking with, we would have immediately gone our separate ways. I owe him nothing. A hand placed itself on Yuji's head, resting on his hair and prompting him to look up at Chozo's mournful gaze. His sadness succumbed to the fondness he held so proudly, breaking through as a subtle smile forming on his otherwise reserved appearance. Wherever Yuji goes, I'll follow to make sure he's safe. It's an older brother's duty to look out for his younger siblings. It is the least I can do to make up for what I've done. Chozo. I don't deserve you. I guess that settles that then. Chozo ain't gonna go on a killing spree unless someone hurts his precious Yuji here. And I'm sure as hell not going to draw Big Brother's wrath. Sounds like a problem for future me to deal with. Poor bastard. I don't, you heard what I said, Yuji stuttered about, trying to process Gojo's decision. His answer came too fast. It shouldn't have been that easy. What happened with Sukuna? Wasn't just your fault. You said it happened after I got sealed, right? That kinda makes it my fault too, considering Sukuna wouldn't have stood a chance if I were there. I'm sure you've heard this little known fact about me, but I am the strongest. But, for the sake of my good image, we'll blame the whole thing on Suguru. Hey, that's not how this works. His sensei laughed as Geto curled his fist, readying another blow to the head as he'd already done a few times up till now. I was only joking. Gojo pleaded for mercy at the threat, raising his hands as a pointless shield when his infinity could do so much more. Iori joined in with the laughter, not nearly with the same amount of energy as his sensei put out, cursing the both of them as she choked on her coffee a second time. Chozo didn't laugh. That's fine. He didn't come off as the type to do so. Yuji, however, did, but he could not laugh, let alone muster even the faintest of chuckles to go along with what had to be nothing more than a joke made in ignorance to lift the mood. His behavior was going to seem weird. He knew it was a matter of seconds before Gojo would take notice, and hiding his face in the collar of his hoodie would do nothing, even if he felt better for it. Something wrong. Gojo's words faded out as he turned past Yuji to something else outside. The shadow created by the additional standing just outside the threshold archway of the entrance was what Yuji saw first, directing his eyes to follow it all the way to the end. Eventually meeting the one who had caused the echoes of their laughter to cease. The sun's glare didn't do the man any favors, but the tall build and facial hair Yuji could make out were all that he needed to recognize who they were dealing with. All that was missing was the pair of rectangular sunglasses Yuji was used to seeing the man never leave home without. Sensei Gojo slid in front of Yuji, making no attempt with his luck to hide Chozo behind him as well. You're back early from your mission. You look great. Did you have some fun while you were gone? Try some food? Meet new people? Also, just curious, how did you know where to find us? Suguru is not the only one with sentries around the school, their sensei stepped forward. Fuming out the ears as he took one look at Yuji's head poking out behind Gojo's legs before pointing at the 3 students he was responsible for. Who wants to tell me just what in the goddamn hell is going on? Notes. I'm gonna say this for every chapter, but this came out longer than expected. And there was no good place that I wanted to split it, so here we are. Who? All 4 of our main dudes got their povs. I can finally take a break. I have a plan for what comes next, but povs have yet to be decided. I'm probably going to stick with these 4 and just cycle through them to my heart's content, though I have no specific order in mind. Notes. I was not expected to write a fight scene for this fic, at least, so early, but honestly, that was the only way a meeting between Yuji and Sakuna would go down after Shibuya. Crossing my fingers that it's coherent. Edo planned to address the fight between Satoru and Suguru through one of their povs, probably in the next chapter. For now, I wanted to focus on giving Iori some deserved time in the spotlight with her conversation with Yuji. Asking if he was joking or not comes from the manga, as she confirms Suguru's charges against him in a similar manner, questioning if they were real or not. Samona needs to give Yuji a hug. Same deal, I probably have something more to add but that can come later. Thank you guys so much for the feedback. I seriously live off comments. They fuel me better than Red Bull.